Llano Estacado, Texas Panhandle, May 1887. You have to understand the heat. Before the story can begin, you must understand the nature of the enemy. It was not a passing discomfort. It was not a season to be endured with sweat and shade. Here, on this high, flat tableland that the Spanish had so aptly named the Staked Plain, the heat was a form of violence. It was a physical presence that bleached the sky to a milky, indifferent white and hammered the land until it cracked like old pottery. It was a predator. It came in May as a warning, a dry breath from the south that crisped the edges of the few hardy leaves that dared to exist. By June, it was an occupying army. By July, it was a tyrant, demanding submission from every living thing. The air did not move. It shimmered, a visible distortion that made the horizon tremble and lied about the distance to anything. The sun was not a golden orb. It was a white hole in the sky, a wound that bled pure, undiluted power. To be caught in it was to feel your skin tighten, your moisture stolen, your very thoughts slow to a thick, syrupy crawl. It intended to kill you, and it did so without malice, simply by being itself. This was the world Alara Vance now inhabited alone, or not quite alone. She had Thomas, who was 7, and Lily, who was 5. They were her anchors to a world that seemed determined to let her drift away. They were the reason she had not yet shattered. Her husband, Arthur, had been the one who understood this place, or at least had tried to. He was a geologist, a man from the green, rolling hills of Vermont who saw poetry in rock strata and history in the color of dust. The other settlers in the small, desperate town of Providence saw him as an eccentric, a man who collected rocks while they were busy fighting the earth for a few miserable stalks of corn. He had been fascinated by the heat, studying it, measuring it, filling journals with spidery script and intricate diagrams about thermal dynamics and subterranean temperatures. And then, the heat had killed him. A simple, brutal equation. He had gone out to chart a limestone outcrop 2 miles from their shack, had misjudged the water in his canteen, and had been found hours later, his face turned toward the merciless sky. The heat had taken the one man who sought to understand it. The irony was a stone in Alara's throat. Now she was a widow, a liability. The town of Providence was a collection of hard people, forged brittle by the landscape. They knew survival was a collective act, but their charity had sharp edges. Pity was a resource as finite as water. They looked at Alara, with her strange, soft-spoken Eastern accent and her 2 small children, and they saw a problem waiting to happen. A burden for the coming winter, if she could even survive the summer. Their shack, built by Arthur with more hope than skill, was a trap. It was a box made of wood and tar paper, designed to catch and hold the sun's fury. By 10 in the morning, the air inside was thick and suffocating. By noon, touching the western wall was like touching a skillet. The children would lie on the floorboards, listless and pale, their breathing shallow. Alara would soak rags in their precious rationed water and lay them on their foreheads, watching the moisture vanish into the greedy air in moments. This was not living. It was the slow process of being cooked. She knew, with a certainty that was as cold as the heat was hot, that they would not last until August. Lily was already developing a persistent, dry cough. Thomas had lost his boyish energy, moving with the slow, deliberate care of an old man. The heat was consuming them piece by piece. Pity was a blanket that smothered will, and she felt the town's pity every time she walked to the communal well to receive her family's meager allotment of water. One evening, as a sunset of bruised purple and violent orange offered no relief, Ilara sat by the weak flame of a tallow lamp, unable to sleep in the oppressive warmth of the shack. She opened Arthur's last trunk, the one filled with his journals. She was not looking for a solution. She was looking for him. For the comfort of his familiar handwriting, for a memory of the man who had seen wonder in this desolate place. She pulled out a leather-bound volume, its cover warped by the dryness, the last one he had been working on. His final entries were not about rocks, but about heat. He had become obsessed with it, not as a geologist, but as a physicist. He wrote of the Roman hypocaust, of Persian wind catchers, of the simple, profound wisdom of burrowing animals. One passage seized her. "The surface is a lie," he had written. "It is an interface of violence between atmosphere and geology. The sun is a tyrant who rules the first few feet of earth, but his dominion is shallow. 10 feet down, the earth does not remember summer. It does not remember winter. It holds a deep, quiet memory of the annual average, a constant. Here, in this scorched land, that constant is a treasure beyond measure. It is coolness. It is life. It is a cellar of endless, gentle spring." Below the passage was a detailed map of their small plot of land and the scrubby, unremarkable hill that rose behind it. He had marked a spot on the north-facing slope, a place where a narrow fissure, almost invisible beneath a tangle of mesquite roots, split the limestone. He had taken temperature readings. While the surface air was 115 degrees, the air exhaling from that tiny crack was a steady 68 degrees. He had sketched a design, a fantasy, a home not built upon the earth, but within it. An entrance hall that sloped gently downwards, opening into a series of rounded chambers carved directly from the rock. At the highest point, a narrow ventilation shaft, a chimney, would pierce the surface. He had filled the margins with calculations, with notes on airflow and convection. "The structure breathes," he wrote. "The cool, dense air pools at the bottom. Body heat and cooking warm it slightly, causing it to rise. It is drawn out of the chimney, and this act of leaving pulls fresh, cool air in through the entrance. A self-perpetuating cycle. A limestone lung." Ilara stared at the drawing. It was madness. It was the dream of a man who had not understood the back-breaking reality of this land. And yet, she could feel it. The cool air on her skin, the quiet dark. She looked at her children, sleeping fitfully in the sweltering shack, their faces flushed. Desperation is the mother of all unconventional solutions. The next morning, she did not mend the fence or try to coax life from her withered garden. She took Arthur's rock hammer, a shovel, and a pry bar, and walked to the northern face of the hill. She found the fissure, a dark slit breathing a promise of coolness. She began to dig. The work was a new kind of hell. The sun beat on her back, but she ignored it, focusing on the small patch of shade offered by the hillside. The topsoil was baked hard as brick. It took her an hour to clear the entrance, her hands already blistering. Then she hit the limestone. It was not solid, but fractured and layered, just as Arthur's notes had predicted. She used the pry bar to break off chunks, the hammer to shatter them into manageable pieces. She hauled the rubble out bucket by bucket, her shoulders screaming in protest. Each inch was a victory. Each foot was a testament to her will. The children watched her, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. "What are you doing, Mama?" Thomas asked, his voice small. "I'm building our new home," she said, her voice raspy with dust and effort, trying to project a confidence she did not feel. A cool home. A forever home. By the third day, the town had noticed. Her absence at the usual morning gathering was conspicuous. Then someone saw her, a lone figure on the hillside, engaged in what looked like a frantic, nonsensical act of destruction. Marcus Thorne saw her himself on the fourth day. Thorne was the closest thing Providence had to a leader. He was the water diviner, the well digger, the man who understood the grim calculus of survival in this place better than anyone. He had built his own house from thick adobe, with a deep cellar for storing goods, and it was considered the pinnacle of local engineering. He was a practical man, with no time for dreams or folly. He strode up the hill, his face a mask of grim authority. He was not a cruel man, but his certainty was a weapon. He saw the growing pile of rubble, the dark hole Ilara was carving into the earth, and his face hardened. "Mistress Vance," he said. His voice was not a question, but a judgment. Ilara stopped, leaning on her shovel, sweat carving clean paths through the grime on her face. She looked at him, her eyes clear and defiant. "Mr. Thorne?" "The town is concerned," he said, gesturing vaguely at her excavation. "This is an indulgence. Your garden is failing. Your children need you. What is this madness?" "It's a home," she said simply. Thorne let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of humor. "A home? That is a grave, madam. You are digging a grave. Do you have any idea what you are doing? The ground here sweats alkali. In the deep heat, poisonous vapors can seep from the rock. Snakes, scorpions, vermin? That is what you will find in a hole in the ground. You are burying your children alive." "My husband was a geologist," Ilara countered, her voice quiet but firm. "He studied this hill. This rock is stable. It's cool." "Your husband," Thorne said, and for a moment a flicker of something like pity crossed his face before it was extinguished by impatience. "Your husband was a man of books and theories. He did not understand this land. He did not understand the sun. His books are what got him killed. I am telling you, as the man who has kept this town alive for 10 years. This is dangerous foolishness. Stop this. Come back to the world. We will help you reinforce your shack. We will ensure your water ration." It was an offer of conventional help for a conventional problem. It was an offer to continue the slow process of being cooked, but with the town's blessing. "No," she said. The word was small, but it was absolute. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Thorne, but this is our path." Thorne stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. He saw not a resourceful survivor, but a woman unhinged by grief, clinging to the last, insane ramblings of her dead husband. He had offered help, and she had refused it. His responsibility was now absolved. He turned and walked back down the hill. The verdict was delivered that afternoon in the shade of the general store. "The widow has lost her mind," Thorne announced to the assembled men. "She's digging a burrow like a coyote, refused all help, calls it a home. The community's pity curdled instantly into a kind of grim, morbid fascination. Vance's folly, they called it, the widow's grave. Ilara was no longer a liability to be managed, but a spectacle to be observed. Her isolation was now complete. She was a ghost, haunting the edge of their world, performing a ritual of madness that could only end in tragedy. They would watch, and they would wait. Before we see how the great Scorch of '87 tested Vance's folly against Thorne's conventional wisdom, I want to ask you to be part of this community. These stories are about finding wisdom in forgotten places. If that resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. And tell me in the comments, what is the most unconventional piece of wisdom someone has ever shared with you? Something that went against all common sense, but turned out to be true. I read every single one. Now, let us see what happens when the sun truly goes to war. The narrator must now pause this story. To understand the miracle that was about to unfold and the catastrophe it would avert, you must first understand the fundamental physics of the two opposing ideas. You must understand the genius of Ilara's folly and the hidden flaw in Marcus Thorne's expertise. Let us first examine the conventional solution, the shack, and even Thorne's superior adobe house. These structures were designed with a single, flawed principle in mind: to create a barrier against the sun. They were shields. But a shield, when left in the sun, eventually gets hot. Think of a wooden or adobe house sitting on the Texas plains. From sunrise to sunset, it is bombarded with solar radiation. The roof and the west-facing wall absorb the most energy. This energy heats the material itself. This is called thermal mass. Wood has some, but thick adobe, which Thorne championed, has a great deal. His theory was sound, to a point. The thick walls would take all day to heat up, keeping the interior cooler during the peak of the afternoon. But this theory contained a fatal error, a betrayal that occurred every single night. The sun would go down, but the house, now saturated with a full day's worth of thermal energy, would begin to radiate that heat inward. The adobe walls, which had been a shield all day, became a furnace all night. Relief never came. The people slept in ovens of their own making, emerging in the morning already weary, stepping from a 95-degree house into 90-degree air, with no chance to recover before the assault began anew. Furthermore, these houses were not airtight. Small gaps in the doors and windows allowed the superheated outside air to infiltrate constantly, while any attempt at ventilation, like opening a window, only invited the furnace blast inside. It was a battle of attrition they were doomed to lose. Now, let us examine the principles behind Vance's folly. Ilara was not building a shield to fight the heat. She was building a gateway to access a vast, permanent reservoir of cold. The first principle was geothermal stability. The sun's energy penetrates the earth, but very poorly. A few feet down, the daily temperature swings vanish. About 10 to 20 feet down, even the seasonal variations disappear. The Earth at that depth remains at a near constant temperature, which is the average yearly air temperature for that location. In that part of Texas, this was a cool, stable 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a cellar of perfect natural coolness, a gift from the planet itself. While Thorne's house was battling a 120-degree enemy, Ilara's home was simply borrowing the deep, unshakable coolness of the earth. The limestone walls were not absorbing heat from the outside. They were permanently anchored to a massive, cool thermal battery. The second principle was convective airflow, what Arthur had called the limestone lung. This was the true genius of the design. It was not a static hole, it was a living, breathing system. Her dwelling had one low entrance and one high, narrow chimney. Air has weight. Cool air is denser and heavier than warm air. The cool, 68-degree air from the deep earth would naturally pool at the bottom of her excavated rooms. When Alara and her children were inside, their bodies produced heat. When she cooked, that produced heat. This created a pocket of slightly warmer air. This warmer air, being lighter, would rise. Where would it go? To the highest point in the dwelling, the top of the chimney. As it drifted out of the chimney into the outside world, it created a tiny, almost imperceptible area of low pressure behind it. This low pressure, in turn, gently pulled more air into the dwelling through the only other opening, the low entrance. It created a constant, silent, and completely natural circulation. The house exhaled its warm, stale air and inhaled fresh, geothermally cooled air. It was perpetual motion, powered by the simple laws of physics. The final, subtle principle was evaporative cooling. The limestone in that region was porous. It allowed minuscule amounts of groundwater to seep through, not enough to form puddles, but just enough to make the walls feel cool and slightly damp to the touch. As the circulating air passed over these damp walls, it caused this tiny amount of moisture to evaporate. The phase transition from liquid to gas requires energy, and it pulls that energy in the form of heat directly from the air. The air entering at 68 degrees was further chilled to perhaps 65 degrees, and its humidity was raised to a comfortable, healthy level, a stark contrast to the desiccating air outside. So you see, Thorne's house was a weapon in a losing war. It was a shield that eventually became a radiator. Ilara's home was a conversation. It was a partnership with the earth. One shouted defiance at the sun and was slowly destroyed. The other whispered a request to the deep rock and was granted sanctuary. One was a monument to struggle. The other was an embodiment of wisdom. By late June, the folly was a home. From the outside, it was still just a dark hole in the side of the hill, framed by a crude wooden door she had fashioned from their old shack. But inside, it was another world. A sloping tunnel, about 15 feet long, opened into a large central chamber, roughly 12 by 12 feet. The ceiling was an arch, following the natural strength of the rock. Two smaller alcoves served as sleeping chambers, just large enough for beds of pine needles and soft blankets. She had carved shelves into the walls for their few possessions. A small fire pit near the chimney allowed her to cook, the smoke drawn cleanly up and out. The air was the most remarkable thing. It was cool, with the clean, mineral scent of deep earth and damp stone. It was still and quiet, the roar of the wind and the oppressive weight of the sun completely absent. After the first night spent inside, they woke not to a stifling oven, but to a gentle, refreshing chill. Lily's cough vanished in 2 days. Thomas's energy returned, his laughter echoing softly off the stone walls. For the first time since Arthur's death, Alara felt a sense of peace that was not just the absence of fear, but the presence of safety. The summer deepened its assault. July arrived and decided to break the world. The temperature climbed from 110 to 115, and then, for one blistering week, it held at an almost unbelievable 120 degrees. The sky was no longer white. It was a brassy, shimmering haze. The wind died completely. The world held its breath, and the air itself felt flammable. They called it the Great Scorch. In the town of Providence, life ground to a halt. It became an exercise in pure survival. The adobe houses were now unbearable tombs of heat. People spent their days lying on the floor in the darkest corners of their homes, wrapped in wet sheets that dried in minutes. Thorne's main well began to falter, the water level dropping daily, the taste becoming thick with minerals. His authority, once as solid as his adobe walls, began to show cracks. People looked at him with desperate, accusing eyes. His certainty was failing them. His own wife was struck down with heat sickness, her breathing shallow, her skin terrifyingly dry and hot. Inside her hill, Ilara baked bread. The heat from her small oven was a minor inconvenience, whisked away up the chimney. The children played with small stones on the cool floor. They slept soundly through the nights, wrapped in blankets against the pleasant 65-degree chill. Their small carved cistern wept cool, clean water, a drop at a time, keeping it full. They were not enduring, they were living. In the heart of the furnace, Ilara Vance had found a pocket of eternal spring. She would look out the entrance tunnel at the shimmering, distorted world and feel not fear, but a profound, quiet gratitude for her husband's brilliant, gentle madness. The crisis in Providence came to a head on the fourth day of the 120-degree heat. Marcus Thorne's youngest son, Daniel, collapsed while walking from the house to the well. His body, unable to cool itself, had simply given up. Thorne carried his limp form inside, his heart a cold knot of terror in his chest. The boy's skin was burning. He was barely conscious. Thorne looked at his wife, pale and weak in her bed. He looked at his son, fading before his eyes, and in that moment, all his certainty, all his hard-won expertise, all his pragmatic knowledge shattered into dust. His methods had failed. His house was a killer. His well was dying. He was watching his family perish, and he was powerless. And then, a thought, unwelcome and insane, flickered in his mind. The madwoman on the hill. The widow's grave. He had built his home to defy the sun. She had dug a hole to hide from it. In his world of logic, she and her children should be dead, boiled in their own tomb, suffocated by poisonous vapors. But what if they weren't? What if the ravings in her husband's journals held a truth his own experience could not comprehend? Desperation is a powerful acid. It dissolves arrogance, pride, and prejudice. All that was left was the terrifying, animal need to save his son. He lifted Daniel, wrapping him in a still damp sheet, and stumbled out into the blinding, brutal glare of the afternoon sun. He did not tell anyone where he was going. He did not have a plan. He was a man running on a single, desperate, impossible hope. The walk to Vance's Folly was a journey through hell. The heat rose from the ground in waves, the air so hot it hurt to breathe. Thorne's vision swam. The sun hammered his skull. He was a strong man, but the heat and his terror were draining him, second by second. He focused on the low hill, a hazy shape in the shimmering distance. He expected to find a scene of tragedy. He expected to smell death. It would be a grim confirmation of his own wisdom, a final, bitter lesson for the foolish widow. He staggered up the last few feet of the slope, his lungs burning. He reached the entrance, a dark maw in the white-hot limestone. He was prepared for the worst. And then he felt it. A breath. A gentle, impossible exhalation of cool, damp air flowing from the mouth of the cave. It was so contrary to the world around him that for a moment he thought he was hallucinating, that the heat had finally broken his mind. It was like finding a spring in a desert of fire. He stumbled forward, his legs giving way, and fell to his knees in the entrance of the tunnel. The coolness washed over him, a physical shock, a baptism. He looked down the sloping passage into the main chamber. It was lit by a single, soft-burning lamp. He saw the two children, Thomas and Lily, playing quietly on the floor, their faces healthy and calm. He saw Elara Vance rise from a small stool, her expression not of alarm, but of a kind of sad, knowing pity. They were not just alive, they were well, they were comfortable, they were safe. The sight was a judgment more absolute than any words. Everything he knew was wrong. Everything he had mocked was right. He had built a fortress that had become a prison. She had carved a sanctuary that was a haven. He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. He could only make a dry, rasping sound. He held out his son, a silent, desperate plea. Elara came forward without a word. She took the boy from his arms and carried him into the cool darkness. She laid him on a soft bed of pine needles and began to sponge his face and neck with a cloth dipped in cool water. Thomas and Lily watched, their eyes wide. Thorne crawled the rest of the way into the chamber and collapsed onto the stone floor. The coolness of it against his skin was a mercy so profound it felt like a dream. He laid his cheek against the rock and felt the deep, steady pulse of the earth's ancient cold. He watched as Elara tended to his son, her movements efficient and calm. She was not a madwoman. She was a queen in her subterranean kingdom, a master of an element he had never even known existed. After a long time, Daniel's breathing steadied. The flush began to recede from his cheeks. Elara brought Thorne a dipper of water. It was the coldest, purest water he had ever tasted. He drank it, and it was like drinking life itself. He finally found his voice. It was a broken, humbled thing. How? It was the only word he could manage. It contained everything: his confusion, his shame, his awe. How had she done this? How had she conquered the unconquerable enemy? Elara sat on the floor across from him. She did not gloat. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep and weary empathy. She understood that his world had been undone. "You tried to fight the sun," she said, her voice soft in the quiet of the cave. "My husband taught me that some things are too powerful to fight. You can only go where they are not." She gestured to the stone walls around them. "The sun's authority ends here. The earth has a deep memory of winter. You just have to know how to ask it to share." She spent the next hour explaining it to him. She spoke of thermal mass, not as a shield, but as an anchor to the planet's core temperature. She explained the limestone lung, the gentle, constant breath of the house. She showed him the damp walls, where the air itself was refreshed and cooled. She was not lecturing him. She was sharing a gospel. Marcus Thorne, the expert, the authority, became a student. He listened, and for the first time in his life, he understood the vastness of his own ignorance. He had been living on the violent, burning skin of the world, while an ocean of calm and coolness lay just beneath his feet. He and his son stayed in the cave through the night. The next morning, Ilara sent him back to Providence with 2 large canteens of cool water and a promise. "Bring your wife," she said. "There is room." Thorne returned not just with his wife, but as a changed man. He was an evangelist. He gathered the townspeople, his face streaked with dust and humility, and he told them. He told them of the cool air, the healthy children, the water that tasted of stone and winter. He told them that everything they thought they knew about survival was wrong. There was disbelief, then curiosity. Led by Thorne, a small group made the pilgrimage to Vance's Folly. They stood at the entrance and felt the breath of the cave. They saw Ilara, the woman they had pitied and mocked, standing at the door to her sanctuary, offering them a dipper of cool water. It was a moment that remade their world. That summer, the town of Providence did not die. It dug. Led by Thorne, who now worked with a convert's feverish energy, and guided by the principles in Arthur Vance's journals, which Ilara freely shared, they began to build their own summer cellars. They were not as grand as Ilara's home, but they followed the same rules. They dug down into the earth, creating cool rooms where families could retreat during the brutal peak of the day. They learned to ventilate them, to create the gentle, life-giving breath. Ilara Vance was no longer the widow, the liability, the fool. She became their foundation. She was the quiet innovator, the keeper of the new wisdom. She never sought recognition, but she earned a respect that ran deeper than any title. She had not just saved her own family. She had given the entire community a future. They learned to live with the heat, not by fighting it, but by partnering with the earth. The Vance method, as it came to be known, transformed Providence from a place of grim endurance into a place of true settlement. Years later, an elderly Marcus Thorne would often be seen sitting with his grandchildren in the cool shade of a porch, a replica of Arthur Vance's journal in his lap. He would point to the drawing of the limestone lung, the elegant arrows showing the flow of air. "Your house shouts at the sun," he would say, quoting a line he had heard Ilara speak once. "It spends all its energy yelling. But a home like this," he would tap the drawing, "a home like this tells a story to the earth. And the earth, if you listen, will always tell you a story of coolness and life in return." Her folly had become their scripture. So, what about you? What killing heat are you trying to endure with conventional thinking? What sun are you trying to fight with a shield that is slowly cooking you from the inside? We all have these challenges in our lives, in our work, in our hearts. We are taught to build higher walls, to fight harder, to shout louder at the problem. But what if the answer isn't on the violent surface? What forgotten journal? What piece of ancestral wisdom? What quiet observation holds the key? What hillside cave are you avoiding because the world has told you it is madness to dig? What deep, cool truth is waiting just a few feet below the surface of your struggle? The earth remembers coolness even in the fire. Your forgotten knowledge is the key. Start clearing the entrance. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters and specific events are fictional, created to illustrate a principle. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only, and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified experts before undertaking any construction or survival-related activities.